We will be back in the book of Mark and related places for a while now. And one thought struck me as we were singing that last song, upheld by my righteous, omnipotent hand. Think about that for a second. How can someone's hand be righteous? Well, when everything they do is absolutely righteous. And how can it be omnipotent? When they can do whatever it is they choose to do. And that's why God can say, it's my hand, it's righteous and it's omnipotent, and it's that hand that I offer you and bring into your life. So anyway, just my devotional from that verse. Let's pray. Lord, thank you so much for your word and for the power of your word. Thank you that as we come and look into it and seek to understand it, that you are helping and guiding. And we ask that you would do that, and we ask that you would help us to apply it in very powerful ways in our own lives. And so we thank you for your word, and we ask you to open it up for us this morning. In your name we pray. Amen. Please be seated. Anytime you see a parade, there's a sense of celebration. And there are all kinds of parades. We've seen some in South America that we couldn't believe or even understand some of the stuff that was going on. Of course, in our area, we've seen a couple of them recently for sports teams, that kind of thing. And it's supposed to be a celebratory thing. It's supposed to be a celebration for the person. If it was a star or a politician or someone that was having a parade, he would be the focus of the parade. If it's a team, again, the people on the team would be part of the focus of that parade. And it's all about celebrating something. It's all about celebrating someone. And as we get back into the book of Mark, we're starting at a place where they throw a parade. And Jesus comes into town, and that's exactly what he does. He rides on the back of a donkey, comes into town, and there are people all over the place joining in and celebrating who he is. As a matter of fact, Zechariah 9:9 says, "Rejoice, O people of Zion, shout in triumph, O people in Jerusalem. Look, your king is coming to you. He is righteous and victorious, yet he is humble and riding on a donkey's colt." And so you see the Messiah, who could have come in on a military horse, a war horse, could have come in on a chariot. I mean, he could have demanded those kinds of things, but he took a donkey and some coats thrown over it, and he rode into town, and the whole idea of this parade just took off after that. Just kind of to remind ourselves of where we are in the book of Mark. Book of Mark divides roughly into three categories. The first one is Mark 1 through 8:21, and that takes place primarily in Galilee. There are other things as well, but the ministry in Galilee is very public. There's a lot of healing, a lot of teaching that goes on. And then at the end of chapter 8, they start a journey that takes them all the way to Jerusalem, and there's several chapters there. What's going on in these chapters primarily is a time when Jesus is working and teaching his disciples. He's focusing on them. The crowds and all that are behind, and this is a time frame when he's focusing on them, encouraging them, helping them to look forward to see what's coming. And then today we start into that third section where basically everything from Mark chapter 11 to the end of the book takes place in 1 week. And that's where we're going to be for a while. So as we get into that, we're going to start with that whole triumphal entrance of Jesus. So let's jump in, chapter 11, verse 1. As they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage and Bethany on the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent two of his disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and just as you enter it, you'll find a coat which no one has ever ridden. Untie it, bring it here." And then he tells them, "Hey, if anybody says anything, tell them that I need it. I'll send it back." And they go, and that's exactly what happens. And they bring the colt back to Jesus, and they threw their cloaks over it, and he sat on it. Let's look at that first map, if we will, just to give you a sense of it. So we've got Bethany over here, and that's about 2 miles from Jerusalem. Bethphage is about 1 mile, and this whole area through here is the Mount of Olives, an area where you can actually look down into Jerusalem, especially into that temple area. So get that in your mind. So this is, Jesus is coming from Bethany. They headed on into Bethphage, and we're not sure where exactly they got the donkey, but once they get past Bethphage, they're starting down the Mount of Olives, okay? And as they start down the Mount of Olives, that's where a lot of what happens in these first few verses takes place. Now, here we go with verse 8. Many people spread their cloaks on the road, and others spread branches, and they had cut in the fields. And I was thinking about that this week. In our country, if you know there's going to be some really famous person and there's going to be a certain parade route you're going to use, well, most times cities will go through and they'll really make sure that that road is filled. There's no potholes. It's clean. There isn't garbage all over the place because they want the parade route to be just right for the dignitary or whoever it is that's coming through. Well, on one level, that's exactly what they're doing. They're paving the road for Jesus with branches and coats. And probably me, if I was a 12-year-old at that time, I'd be taking my coat and then running up front and putting it down again and waiting until he goes by and then running up front and taking it again. The reality is this was to honor the person who was riding in. They were saying, hey, we are preparing the way for you to come. And so they walked all over the branches and all over the coats, and Jesus headed right into town. Those who went ahead, so people are coming with him, a crowd grows as it goes down, as they're putting their coats down and the branches. And they yelled, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest. And Hosanna means save us, O Lord, we pray, or we beg you to save us, or please deliver us. And all of these words are coming out of Psalm 118. They're actually quoting a messianic psalm as they're watching Jesus come into town. They're yelling these things out. So understand, you've got these people coming, and you've got Jesus riding on the coat, and he's the focus, and everybody is saying things like this. They're saying, Hosanna, God, save us. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Jesus is coming in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. That's messianic. They're looking at Jesus and they're saying, the Messiah is here. That's who this is. And that is who they are celebrating. And so as Jesus rode that donkey down into Jerusalem, that shout keeps going. And, Mark gives us that side of it. Now, Luke gives us a little bit more detail. In Luke 19:37, and I think it's in your notes there, it says, so Luke 19:37, when he came near to the place where the road goes down in the Mount of Olives. Okay, remember, we're coming down through all these areas, and now he comes over that hill. He looks down the Mount of Olives at Jerusalem and at the city, especially at the temple. Okay, so he's looking down, and the whole crowd of disciples is joyful, and they're praising God and saying, blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven, glory in the highest. And let's go ahead and show that other map there. So this is a little different map. It gives you a little more relief so you have a sense of the mountain range. So this is Mount of Olives. Not really huge, but it's taller than this area here. Bethany, and I think what's happening in the book of Luke was being recorded is just as he crosses over and he looks down here, people are celebrating and people are yelling and people are saying things. And it's at this point when people are saying, blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven, glory on the highest, that the Pharisees speak up. And the Pharisees say, teacher, rebuke your disciples. Rebuke them. I mean, here they're celebrating, there's joy, they're quoting messianic scriptures, and they're going with Jesus down into Jerusalem. Some of them may have been thinking like, okay, this is it. This is the time. And all of a sudden the Pharisees say, no. You need to stop this. And it's essentially what they are saying is, you are not the Messiah. Make them stop. This is blasphemy. That's the statement the Pharisees are making. For them, Jesus is nobody. Oh, he's a pain, and he's a bunch of other things, and maybe he's done some miracles, and maybe he says nice things, but he's not the Messiah. Absolutely not the Messiah. And they are furious that Jesus is allowing this to continue. I love Jesus' answer. I tell you, he replied, and if they keep quiet, the stones will cry out. Now, wouldn't you have loved to have been there for that to happen? All of the rocks, and You've got every kind of sound imaginable, screaming out and yelling and praying and praising. And Jesus said, you make them stop, and guess what? All nature will join in and shout about what is happening today. And so it's a great answer that Jesus gave, and they don't say anything further at that point. Going a little bit further down the road, verse 41, as he came closer to Jerusalem and saw the city, remember he's looking down in, he began to weep. And this is what Jesus said. By the way, that word weep there is to mourn deeply. And so Jesus begins to weep, stops the whole parade. How I wish today that you, of all people, would understand the way to peace. But now it's too late, and peace is hidden from your eyes. On one level, I think Jesus is responding to the religious leaders right here again. He said, hey, the rocks are going to cry out. And then he weeps over Jerusalem, knowing what's coming, knowing prophetically what's going to happen. And he says, I wish you guys would understand. I wish you'd get it. I wish that you would see for the first time who I am and how important that is. But Jesus knew they wouldn't, and that in the end, Rome was going to come. A couple of implications here. First, there's a quote. The Messiah entered Jerusalem on the back of a borrowed burro. I love that quote. On the back of a borrowed burro in the picture, that is poverty, humility, and at the same time majesty, because Jesus, riding on the back of a donkey, made this special. This was unique, and this was the Son of God, the Messiah, coming into Jerusalem. 2 Corinthians 8:9 says, you know the generous grace of our Lord Jesus Christ. Though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, so that by his poverty he could make you rich. I love that verse, and so many different parts to it, that just the whole idea that God gave up everything so that we could be in him and be rich because we are in him. You know, we look at the world and we say, how does someone get rich? Well, they work hard, or they steal it, or they inherit it. But that's just the things of earth. You can't take it with you. And yet, some people work all their lives for that. And Jesus comes along, and he's humble, and he's a servant, and he's the Son of God all at the same time. And I think if we lose our own focus, instead of being our focus on the Lord and the things of God, and we focus on stuff instead, maybe it's time for us to remember the donkey. Jesus' biggest thing was a borrowed donkey so that he could have the parade that needed to happen. And I think about that, and think about, okay, what did Jesus have? Not much, physically. No, clothes on his back, disciples. And yet how many times in this world do we focus on things and stuff rather than on what really matters? The Apostle Paul reminds us that we should have the same attitude as Christ Jesus, and that he was in very nature God and didn't want to consider equality with God something to be grasped after and grabbed onto. So instead, he took on the very nature of a servant. Instead, he became obedient, and even obedient to the death that he was moving towards. And so Jesus the Messiah came, fulfilled all of the promises of God. They were fulfilled. He came, he goes down into Jerusalem riding on the donkey, and they have the parade. And those who believed in him and later on saw him rise from the dead, conquering sin and death, could say, yes, okay, we didn't see how all of it was going to happen, but it happened, and he's here. And so Jesus came, and he became poor so that he could come, and through that poverty of his, we become his children. Luke 19:41. I love this verse. As he came closer to Jerusalem and saw the city ahead, he began to weep. Think about that. I mean, he's in a parade. He's being proclaimed. All this stuff is going on, but he looks down in Jerusalem and he starts to weep. He knows what's coming. And it breaks his heart. That word weep that's used specifically means to wail and lament. It means not just the shedding of tears, but external expression of grief. And the Jewish people were very expressive at times like that. And so Jesus is expressing his grief about what's coming. And some people believe that God is an angry, vindictive God who loves to bring judgment to people. And they think that all he really wants to do is to condemn and to punish. They believe God's up in heaven with his finger on this, just above the button, so that when you do something wrong, he pushes the button and bam, something happens to you. And they have that kind of a picture of God. And Jesus gives us a picture of the heart of God in this verse. Jesus is in sorrow because of Israel's future. He knows what's coming and that nothing will stop it. God's judgment is going to come at some point. And as Jesus looks into the future, he sees the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans, and he responds with mourning and weeping for Jerusalem and those that will die in this process. Now, John gives us some of the clearest teachings about God's purpose in this world. John 3:17, God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. One of my favorite verses, because it really says what God's all about. He sent Jesus, but he didn't send him, with a big sword and with the desire and the ability to wipe everybody out in judgment. That wasn't the purpose. He came not to condemn, but to save the world through him. And God does not seek condemnation and judgment. Now, there is condemnation and judgment for those who reject him, and for religious leaders and teachers of the law. We're going to be facing that condemnation because they rejected Jesus and his message. Only those who reject the gift of forgiveness and salvation were going to face the condemnation. In John 1, chapter 10, we have a description of Jesus coming to his own people, to the Jewish people, and it says, he came into the world that he created. Okay, so there's that statement of this is who he is. He created it all, spoke it into existence, brought the billions and trillions of stars and universes and earth and all that was in it. He brought all of that into existence. He came into the very world he created, but the world didn't recognize him. He came to his own people, and they rejected him. Stop and think about that as Jesus is, this is being said very early in Jesus' ministry. The religious leaders and the powerful Jewish political figures, they rejected Jesus. And they're referred to many times as the chief priests, that would be the high priest and whoever else worked with him on that highest level, and teachers of the law, people who were responsible to make sure others understood and knew what the laws were about. And so you got the chief priests and the teachers of the law. These are the people who should know these things, and they're the ones that don't even want to consider Jesus. So he came to his own people, and they rejected him. Verse 12, but to all who believe in him and accepted him, he gave the right to become the children of God. One of my favorite verses, because it really says, hey, I came for this purpose, and if you believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and that he died for you, then you've accepted him, and you have the right to become a child of God. Now, certainly this applies to the disciples that were there, maybe even some of the people in the crowd, but then later on when Jesus rose from the dead, it applied to all kinds of people, as groups of 5,000 and several others that just believed and turned to Christ en masse. And so they believed in him because they heard about things like maybe the veil in the temple being torn and the Holy of Holies being opened and the priests really not being able to function like they used to because, Jesus came and did something totally different. So as you think through all of these things, my question to each of us is, we need to think this through. Where do we stand? When did I turn to Christ? When did I believe in him? When did I receive him? When did I believe what he said and was saved? And if that isn't something that you can point to, I want to just really challenge you. Because John 1:12 is for you, to all who believe. He gives the right to become the children of God. And so even in this time when Jesus is heading into a whole bunch of hard and difficult things, there's still that sense of him weeping for the people of Jerusalem and longing to be able to do more than he can. Now we have a passage here that's kind of like a bookends in this next section. You've got verses 12 to 14 where the fig tree is cursed, and you've got verses 20 to 21, which is the fig tree dies. And in between, you've got the temple being cleansed. And so think about that, and we'll kind of put it all together in here. You've got the tree, and then you've got the temple cleansing, and then you've got the tree again. And all that kind of, Mark puts it together in that way for us to see. So in verse 12, we have the curse. So the next day, it says that, they came into town, Jesus looked around the temple and went back to Bethany, maybe staying with Lazarus and Mary and Martha. And so they went back to Bethany and stayed. The next day they get up and they walk the 2 miles back into town. And the next day they were leaving Bethany, Jesus was hungry. Seeing in the distance a fig tree and leaf, he went to find out if it had any fruit. Now when he reached it, he found nothing but leaves, because it was not the season for figs. Now Mark is telling us something here. Jesus knew it wasn't the season for figs. All the disciples knew it wasn't the season for figs. They lived in an agricultural society. You know these things when you've grown up with them. And so he's going over to this fig tree, but it really has nothing to do with figs. It isn't about the figs. And yet that seems to be the reason, and that is the reason why Mark puts it there. So he went looking for figs, but there weren't any because it isn't the time for figs. And then he says to the tree, the fig tree, I love the fact that Jesus talked to trees. Isn't that awesome? He said to the tree, may no one ever eat fruit from you again. That's a curse. He's saying, you're never going to have figs ever again. And his disciples heard him say it. Okay, so they kind of noticed, okay, so Jesus came over here, got here, cursed the tree, and now we're going back on into Jerusalem. Again, it was not the season for figs. Mark makes sure that we know that. The disciples heard him say it. They understood the symbolism. Fig tree many times was a symbol of Israel's peace and prosperity. And so if you had a fig tree, you were thinking about all of that. And yet in this case, you've got a fig tree and it doesn't have any fruit, and Jesus curses it. And so you've got a whole bunch of things going on here. And Israel's religious leaders are being pictured, I believe. We're going to explain this a little bit further. But if this is really something where Jesus is taking a symbol, if you will, the fig tree, and cursing it, he's saying to perhaps the Israel's religious leaders, hey guys, you know what? You're a fig tree with no fruit, and you're cursed. And it's very possible that that's the kind of thinking that Jesus had, and that's why Mark explains it to us and explains it to the Roman people who weren't Jewish, and we're trying to figure out what was going on with that. So it's, again, this is one of, like a parable being played out in real life, and Jesus is making the statement, and the religious leaders are the focus of it, because they had no spiritual fruit at all. The religious leaders had nothing. They were dead and barren spiritually. And so Jesus was making some statements, and he'll make some stronger ones a little bit later at the end of the passage. Interesting, you think we're talking about chief priests, and we're talking about teachers of the law. And I was thinking about this week when the wise men came to Jerusalem and said, hey, we're looking for the one born king of the Jews. Man, they were scurrying all over, and finally the question was asked, where's the Messiah supposed to be born? And that's when they went back and looked at the scriptures and said, oh yeah, Bethlehem, 6 miles that way. And so whole caravan goes, and they see Jesus, and they do all the stuff they're going to do, and then they head home a different way. You know what? There's not any kind of sign at all that any of the religious leaders or the chief priests went to Bethlehem. I mean, they just told a bunch of people the Messiah is going to be born there. And they said, oh, good, we're going to go see him. And what do? Good riddance. That's the end. And so on one level, these are the kind of people that Jesus is talking to when he talks about the fig tree. Now, the second thing we see in this bookend places in the middle section, and that's the section that takes place when Jesus arrives in the temple. On reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. Let's go ahead and put that picture up, okay? So just kind of get a sense of this is the temple, and this is huge, okay? Just so that you know how big this area was. It's bigger than 30 football fields, okay? This is like a huge stadium. So this is big. Thousands of people could be in here, okay? And as you see clearly on the left of the temple and the right of the temple, there's something called the Court of the Gentiles, okay? So in this, I got it, might as well use it right there. Court of the Gentiles, all this area. And so believing Gentiles were allowed to come and worship in the temple, but they still couldn't go into the inner area because they were not born Jewish. And so here you've got this big, huge area. And Jesus comes into this area and he begins driving out those who were selling there, lambs and doves and all that kind of stuff. He overturned the tables of the money changers, which, again, this is the 12-year-old me wishing I could see this. I mean, these people who are stacking all their money up in piles, and all of a sudden Jesus comes along and whoa, and all the change just flies all over. Wow. Yeah, he was a bit upset, and with good reason. And then, even the people selling doves, he tips those over, and so you got doves in these little handmade cages and breaking open and doves flying away, and maybe he's chasing the guys that have the lambs out or setting them free and kind of chasing them towards the exits. That's what's going on. That's what Jesus is doing here. This is the other thing. And he would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. They were taking shortcuts through the temple, so they didn't have to walk longer distances to do whatever they were doing. And so no, you know what? You come to the temple to worship. You don't come here to walk through and get somewhere else faster. And so Jesus kind of made a big mess of the whole thing. And, in John 2, we see that Jesus cleansed the temple 3 years earlier. So 3 years earlier, he had already done this. 3 years earlier, he had come in and said the same things and said, hey, wait a minute here. This is God's house, and you guys are treating it horribly. And so he cleansed the temple back then. But I would assume it came back pretty quickly. There's too much money to be made for it to be closed down for too long. Now, originally, let's go ahead and go to this quote. When a cleansed temple isn't filled with goodness, it is soon restocked with evil. That was an appropriate quote, I thought. The temple was cleansed for a purpose, so people could worship God. That was the point, not making money. And so God originally instructed the people of Israel to bring animals from their own flocks. That was the original purpose. You pick an animal, the best one you've got from your own flock, and you bring it with you to celebrate the Passover. And that made it much more personal and a whole bunch of other things. But along the way, people maybe were traveling further, and maybe they would get there and the lamb had had a rough time on the trip, and the lamb was rejected by the priests that had to be inspected. Well, all of a sudden they start setting up markets. And first of all, they were on the Mount of Olives. They had 4 separate markets on the Mount of Olives, which is on the road into the temple. Well, eventually someone said, you know what? Hey, let's put these right inside. It's a whole lot easier. Let's fill up the Court of the Gentiles with these booths and these tables and all these animals. And that was the start of it all. And if you can imagine, you could go there and get a lamb, and you had a guarantee this lamb was going to pass inspection because you were buying it right there from, the guy who got permission from the priest who got permission. So everybody got their cut, and everything was way more expensive for the worshipers, but at least you got to give your lamb. And other things were on sale too, all that was needed for them to be able to do what they did. Now, the money exchange was another one of those things. They could come from anywhere in the world, the known world then, with money that the Jewish people would not accept. And so you had to have money changers. You know, when I got off a plane in Dallas, I had to go to the money changer and sell all my pesos back and get dollars. And guess what? I lost money because the people at the money exchange made money. Okay, well, that's what's going on here. You got people changing money, and they're making some money on that. And so you come in, and you've got to pay for all of the animals and sacrificial things with Jewish currency. You got to pay the temple tax with Jewish currency. And so the money changers were there as well. And so you got people selling animals, people changing money. And 3 years later, again, Jesus goes and does the same thing. Now, verse 17 then says, as he taught them, because this is interesting, he cleanses the temple again, gets them all out of there, and I'm not sure how long that took. But once he started that process, I'm sure there were a lot of people who realized we better just get going so that our tables don't get turned over. And so they all get out, and Jesus sits down to teach them, and he said, is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations? And Mark is the only one that says this. And understand this, Mark was writing to the Roman world, to people who didn't know necessarily about the temple. And so he's saying, hey, God's original intention was that this temple wouldn't just be a Jewish thing, but it would be a place of prayer for all nations, that it would be a light to all nations. That was the point. And so Jesus is making this point and is saying this should be a place of prayer. So again, verse 17 says, it is written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you, and maybe he was looking around at some of the priests and some of the Pharisees and some of the others that were there. He said, but you have made it a den of robbers. Let's go ahead and put that slide back up there, Keaton, if you would. Again, just think about the two areas I showed you earlier. Those are the courts of the Gentiles. Okay? Thousands of people could fit in here. Thousands of people came at Passover to worship from all over the country and from all over the known world. People came to worship at the temple. And what had they done? They'd filled the area where the Gentiles could worship with animals and money changers and all that stuff. So the Gentiles would have a really hard time finding any place to actually worship God that wasn't surrounded by sheep and doves and money. And so when Jesus cleared this all out, on one level what he was saying is, okay, it's time for us to do what this is for. It's time for us to worship. By the way, Josephus said that in AD 66, about 30 years plus past Christ, they had sacrificed 250,000 lambs at Passover. So think about how big this had gotten. So when Jesus comes in, it is not out of the question that, or out of any consideration that those areas were maybe just a few things there. It was probably full with booths and animals and all that kind of stuff. And Jesus said, this is a place of worship. Get your market out of here. And he cleansed the temple and kicked them all out. Now you got to think that maybe the chief priests and teachers of the law would have a reaction to this, right? Verse 18, the chief priests and the teachers of the law heard this and began looking for a way to kill him, for they feared him. Okay, so Jesus comes in, upholds the law, says we are here to worship God and celebrate the Passover, and their response is, he's got to go. He's got to go. And one of the things that's interesting here, the verse says that they're looking for a way to kill him because they feared him, because the whole crowd was amazed, spellbound. They were listening to teaching that made them come alive as they listened to Jesus talk about God's word. So the temple's cleansed. Jesus sits down. He teaches. The people listen. And, of course, the leaders are trying to figure out, how do we kill this guy? And then Jesus pointed out, what was happening. And then at the end of the day, Jesus and his disciples walked 2 miles back to Bethany. And what's been stated very clearly was, had he tried to stay somewhere in Jerusalem, he might have been killed, because there were people who wanted him dead. So they go back out. The next day they get up. And this is the other bookend. In the morning, as they went along, they saw the fig tree withered from the roots. So it isn't like the leaves started to wilt and then the branches kind of got sick. And from the core of this tree, it went bad outward. So right from the core is where it started, and it went bad. And Peter remembered what Jesus had said. They all had, but he says, the fig tree you cursed, it's withered. It's dead. Overnight, it died. Now, Peter expressed his surprise. It was dead, withered from the core outward. And on many levels, think about what this is representing. If Jesus is saying, the fig tree is the nation of Israel, and I've cursed it because the nation of Israel has rejected me, then he says, now, from the core, and I think I'm looking at it in the sense that from the core, from the high priests and the high priest council and the teachers of the law, from there outward, it died. And so the fig tree which represented Israel was no more. He was acting out a parable, if you will. He said, first of all, hey, the tree, I'm going to curse it, no more fruit. And then the next day they come by and he says, yep, there it is. That's exactly what happens, is that from the inside out, from the core outward, it died. And there's a quote here, this real life parable of spiritually dead Israel revealed a severe judgment. This is a huge judgment. Now, it's interesting because the early church later applied this parable to the total destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. So that was still down the road when Jesus proclaimed this parable. But years later, when Jerusalem was destroyed and the temple was destroyed, the people all said, you remember what Jesus said? That's exactly what happened. The tree died. And so there was that fulfillment of that prophecy. One of the prophecies that pointed to this amount is Joel 1:12. Again, the grapevines have dried up, the fig trees have withered, the pomegranate trees, palm trees, and apple trees, all the fruit trees have dried up, and the people's joy has dried up with them. Talk about just a dim picture, but a vivid picture of what Jesus was talking about when he said what he did about the fig tree. Now, what do we take away from all this? Thinking back on what was for sale, it was anything you needed. It was there for sale, whether it was a spice or salt or oil or whatever you needed, it was all there. But the chief priests and the teachers of the law were not doing it because they wanted to help you worship. It wasn't about, hey, let's come together and worship God. It was, okay, my cut's this, your cut's that, let's 10% here, whatever. Make money. We want to become more powerful and more wealthy. So the chief priests and teachers of the law were responsible for bringing this environment about. And so instead of trying to help people coming to Jerusalem like they're supposed to once a year for Passover, they were supposed to come and celebrate. It was supposed to be this wonderful family celebration of God and what he had done for them and remembering the Exodus and all those things. That was part of what it was. Well, now it was, can we get through this and not lose a lot of money to the priests and everybody else? Our priest Jesus was also the perfect lamb. And he offered himself as the final sacrifice of atonement. We don't need sacrifices anymore. We don't need lambs on the altar because Jesus was the last one. And then he sat down at God's right hand where he sits now, interceding for us. Just want to read these verses in closing. Hebrews 4:14. So then, since we have a great high priest who has entered heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to what we believe. No matter how hard it is, no matter how difficult it is, no matter what we're going through, we're supposed to hold on. When the early church was struggling and going through hard things and people were being martyred, they were supposed to hold on and not let go. We have a great high priest sitting at God's right hand so we can hold firmly to what we believe. We say we believe it, hang on to it. That's what we're supposed to do. This high priest of ours, don't you love how it says that? This high priest of ours, our high priest. This high priest of ours understands our weaknesses, for he faced all of the same testing we do, and yet without sin. Our high priest, what an incredible statement. We have a high priest, and he gets us because he's lived his life like we do, only without sin. He went through all the temptations that we face, went through all of the things that we could ever think of. He went through them too. And then died, sinless, perfect sacrifice, and ascended to the Father's right hand. So, our high priest says this in verse 16, "Let us come boldly to the throne of our gracious God. There we will receive his mercy and find his grace to help us when we need it most." Isn't that awesome? I know these are familiar verses. We should never look past them because they're so familiar. Matter of fact, we should grab onto them even more. Let us come boldly to the throne of our gracious God. That's an invitation. And he says, come. You're struggling, you're hurting, you're having problems. Come. Come to the throne of grace. Come to the throne of mercy. We can all come to that throne because he is our high priest. And we will find mercy. We will find grace when we need it most. When do I need it most? Every single day of my life. I wake up and I need the grace and the mercy of God, which my high priest can give me. So may we live daily trusting our great high priest who understands us, gets us, invites us to come and be with him. Let's pray. Lord God, thank you so much for your word, and we thank you for this wonderful passage. We thank you for the example of our Lord, and Lord, I'm just amazed at all that he could go through and all the things that he said and all the things that he did, and all the time knowing that in just a few days he was going to be hung on a cross. And so we thank you for giving us these words so clear so that we can understand. And Lord God, above all, help us to come to our high priest and to keep coming and keep trusting for the grace and mercy he has promised. Thank you, Lord Jesus. In your name we pray. Amen.